I got a really excellent question from one of my tutoring clients, and what he asked was, "Is there such a thing as a bad placement in astrology, and in your birth chart in particular?" So he has been, looking into his chart and found things on the internet and in books that kind of suggest that certain things that are in his chart might not be the best. And in traditional astrology, that was the way that it was looked at when looking at a chart. I mean, birth charts were the big thing in the olden days, but looking at a chart, and if a chart was for a birth or for a marriage or things like that, there were certain placements, certain planets and certain signs or houses that were considered negative, bad, and there were certain planets that were considered malefic, such as Saturn and Mars. So, that was the ancient perspective. And even when there was kind of a resurgence of astrology, an interest in astrology in Europe in Victorian times, including when Aleister Crowley ghost wrote a book for Evangeline Adams, a little bit post-Victorian times, but that those early sort of rediscoverers of astrology did believe that certain charts were just like, too bad for that person that they had that. They would have been a great person, but for this Saturn, or but for this, you know, Venus or something like that, whatever it is. So they were looking at charts and basically judging, is this person going to be successful or not? And of course, looking at success as, are they going to be a great man? So, needless to say, from a magical perspective, that's not going to go. At least I would say so. So my whole perspective on astrology is, we picked our chart, we chose it pre-incarnation in order to gain a certain evolutionary set of work and experience, and maybe even some fun along the way. And it wasn't an accident. So even things that are troublesome, difficult, traumatic, are parts of our biography that we chose intentionally. So it's not, and even if we don't end up being rich or famous or being recognized, that's irrelevant, because we know now that every last individual is contributing to the Akashic record through their thoughts, through their intent, through their actions, their emotions. So everything you do, in a sense, is being recorded, and being put into the great store of human wisdom. So even if the world is destroyed, if a few people live, technically they can tap into the Akashic records and recover that wisdom. So whatever you do, if you have one little insight that you're able to achieve in your lifetime, and think a thought, and you don't even write it down on paper, but you're able to really clearly cognize that and give that to humanity through your intent, you've done a great thing. So there's no, somebody from the outside can look at you and say, oh, that person was a busboy his whole life, and who cares? And too bad for him, and he has such a terrible chart. But that's just not the way to think as an adept or a magician. So we want to take everything we have and work it to positive, work it to the advantage of will. Basically, in Thelema, the idea is, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Will being universal, it is belonging to the divine in Hokmah, and it's completely universal. And then through our individual incarnations, we channel it as an individual in a different way than anyone else can. So we each are our own God. We each have our own place in the cosmos. That having been said, I want to talk about some indications of what I'm calling divine discontent in the chart. So some of us can work our will in the world and never really think of spirituality per se or in any special way. We can seem like ordinary citizens and go about our work. You could be, some type of a major violinist who is a genius, and you're doing concerts all over the world, and you've never thought about this as a spiritual thing, but you are fulfilling your will. So there's some ways of fulfilling will that can be in the world and not particularly drawing attention to themselves, even in that individual's mind, as something spiritual, godly, holy per se. It's something that they are just able to do. It just works out that way, and they don't think about it because they're just doing their thing, and that's great. So the folks who have divine discontent are sort of like those forced into a explicitly holy life of some kind or another. So where some big part of your life is dedicated to spirituality, to serving humanity, to being a holy person of some kind, and that's usually something that requires a lot of soul searching, and it usually is caused by difficulties and trouble. So I want to talk about some indicators in the chart of divine discontent, and I also want to hear from you if you have other ones that maybe you're an astrologer and you've noticed other ones, or maybe you've studied your own chart and believe you found something that forced you into a more explicitly spiritual path than you would have been if you hadn't had those issues. So I'm just going to give you some examples. So one that is, you could have a lot of 12th house focus, because the 12th house is one of solitude. In olden times it was of forced isolation, like in imprisonment and putting into a hospital and things like that. So things that were very unpleasant. But today we can say the 12th house is where you are forced into needing to carve out a space of solitude. If you have a lot of strength in the 12th house, you're basically a hermit type. Something about you demands that you go into that space where you're basically by yourself with your divine. It's not to say you aren't doing things in the world. I mean, typically people do come out and do things, and they take that in, whatever they've created over there, and bring it out into the world itself. But sometimes having a lot of that 12th house takes you out of the world. It makes you feel unworldly. So that also could happen with like a Pisces rising. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that sort of Neptunian I am type of energy can be very dominant. Maybe it's on an angle, so either on the ascendant or on the nadir or in maybe the descendant. That's a little bit questionable. I'd love to hear from you. Or perhaps it's right on the cusp of your 10th house there. So other ones I've talked about, I just did a video on the septile. So if you have a number of septiles, I don't know how many. I don't know how many to say, like a couple. I don't know. You tell me. I have a lot, so it's hard for me to tell where the threshold is. And I don't meet a lot of people. I don't have enough data, so I'd love to hear from you. But if you have septiles in your chart, those angles act like a chiron between those two planets, where they sort of force you to work that energy toward will, toward humanity as a whole. So they force you into a holy role, if you will. And until that time, just things don't go your way at all with regard to those planets. At least that's been my experience, and I've seen that in others as well. Another one that's interesting is a grand cross. So if you have 4 planets or more, if there are some conjunctions there, 4 planets that make a cross, what that does is it sort of forces you back, just constantly into this sort of like rigid, almost like stagnation if you're trying to fight against it. So where there's a certain tremendous pressure, you almost feel like you can't get out of this cage or something like that. So it's like a very forceful way of keeping you in a certain configuration and needing to work from that spot. That takes a lot of discipline. The ego has to be really disciplined and to become more passive, to become more receptive and gentle, to not try to do what everybody else gets to. Everybody else is partying, everybody else is doing whatever, getting their best job, dating, whatever it may be. It depends on the issues involved depend on the houses and signs and planets. But the point is, someone with that configuration looking around the world can say, like, why am I stuck? Why do I have so much, like, I'm constantly forced back into this position? Well, that could be something easily could force you into a spiritual path, because the only way to overcome that is to surrender to it and work from that position of being very bound like that. So I thought of some other ones. I guess this is more vague, but people with very troublesome either Saturns or Chirons in their chart. So Saturn being the planet of your law, so your structure, which forces you to obey it or else it causes you problems. Chiron being the planet of the wounded healer, to wherever that is, whatever house it's in, and by whatever sign, are things that you feel wounded by, to the point where you really, when you try to get them, you desperately want those things. I've done a whole bunch of videos on these about a life theme. You want those things, but you can't get them unless you give it up to will. So you have to do it for the whole, for the collective, for humanity as a whole, for spirit, however you want to put that. But so if there's enough trouble like that, depends on what else is in the chart, so there's a little bit more vague, then the person will be basically forced to be more spiritual, because they just can't get satisfaction on earth, so to speak, at least for their ego, I should say. Maybe on earth is the wrong way to put that. But and I would like to hear from you. So what other things in a chart can be a sign or an indicator of divine discontent that sort of forces someone into an explicitly holy person role? Love to hear from you.